Good evening, everyone, and thank you for joining us this late. Uh,
Good evening, everyone.
yeah, so me and Hetman are kind of kicking this idea around for a while of talking about the Iraq War in a little bit of detail, and probably in increasing detail in upcoming shows as well. So tonight we're sort of going to do a broad overview of the first decade or so of Iraq 2. Um,
Mhm. And the thing is that Daedalus and I have a very interesting perspective because we're of the age where we remember this war quite a bit. The very beginning of it in 2003, and of course, when we were in high school, just
yeah,
seeing it all over the place.
strictly speaking, it's kind of still inside the realm of not history yet. Um,
It
but
hasn't, usually for an event to be well understood, it needs about I forget who said this or what historian said this, but you need about 80 years
yeah,
to truly understand an event. And the second Iraq War, or some people just, I think, call it the Iraq War. It is not. There's a lot. It's not exactly very easy to understand it.
well, that has a lot to do with the fact that the Department of Defense is bound to determine that no one will understand what's happening. There are two reports that were written about the totality of the Iraq War, and they're very detailed at 27,000 pages apiece. And I haven't finished them.
Have
But
you looked at it?
I have. However,
Yeah.
this is my show and I get to make the rules. So we're doing this anyway. Uh, so like Kevin said, we were in high school when this began. Actually, we were just our first year of high school, coming out of
Yeah.
eighth grade into high school.
Basically like eighth grade, and then high
April,
school.
yeah, it would have been.
I
It would have been
remember
the tail end of eighth grade.
I remember it so well because, it's in the aftermath of 9/11, and, you have this, increasing sort of patriotic fervor from that. And it was a very easy time, I think, for the public to be led into something like that.
Sort
At
of.
the same time, though, there was such a large movement against it. But I remember um, just thinking at the time, understanding why we were in Afghanistan, and then somewhat being puzzled as to why we're invading Iraq. Of course, we all knew that, Saddam Hussein, we knew about the Gulf War, but, you know, at the time, even then, it seemed very, very phony to
Well,
try to link Saddam with the events of 9/11. And it turns out that he had absolutely nothing to do with it. And even the CIA cautioned the Bush administration about invading Iraq. We know this in hindsight now, which
yeah, we,
is,
we, we know actually quite a bit about this whole sequence of events in hindsight. The thing I think really is that the story kind of begins in 1991, which was our childhood's Palm Dad, when we
yeah,
were small children. The first Iraq War and the first, or not Iraq, well, the first Desert Storm,
yeah,
um,
Gulf War.
Gulf War, that happened, and it was quick, and it was a resounding success for the United States military. And
The intention of that, too, was never to
invade Iraq.
invade Iraq. It was essentially to destroy the Iraqi army in Kuwait, eject them out of Kuwait. And, it was very quick, successful, and sort of this example of sort of American, you know, it kind of defined, for the last 30 years, sort of American military dominance. I mean, it's
Yeah.
sort of a textbook operation of that.
So
Um,
we learned a number of lessons in that war, but the Iraqis learned some lessons too. Principally, they learned not to sit out in the middle of the open. That turns out to be not work out so well for them. and that will come into play in a little bit. The second thing that we kind of come up is we come up to 2001 and 9/11 happens, and I remember being described as a "where were you when" moment. So I do remember where I was. I was in band class. It was second period.
I
Uh,
was in I was in science class,
and this would have
and
been before the new junior high school opened because I think we both went to the.
yeah, we were the first graduating class of that new
Yeah.
of the
So
new junior high school. I remember the principal coming over the intercom, and I remember him saying that there has been a terrorist attack in New York City, and that for all of the students to assemble in their homerooms. And I remember thinking, because I guess I was a pretty nerdy kid, and
you're about to
I,
say the
re-
same thing I'm
I
about
had
to
a
say.
vague knowledge of the Oklahoma City bombing. So I thought
No,
it was
what
something.
I did when I heard her come over the announcement was I mentally auto completed to Middle East.
I didn't. I thought it's going to be something like, I didn't even think of the Middle East before. I mean, I knew about Iraq. I knew about, you know, I actually didn't know about that much about Afghanistan at that time, other than it existed, but I didn't know anything about its history, the Soviet Afghan War, or anything like that. I just, you know,
This was a
I,
good. This was probably I
yeah,
think it was a good year before we met.
it was, yeah,
9/11.
it was a
Yeah,
year.
we started hanging out in your basement for inordinate periods of time, talking about things you barely understood.
Yeah,
Only the next year. So this was very formative. Like the entire tenor of the world we had suddenly existed shifted, and that
of course.
shift that shift carried into this thing for 2003. Like for everyone who lived through 9/11 and saw the thing, Afghanistan felt, for lack of a better word, righteous.
Of course.
Uh,
Of course, it felt extremely righteous, and
and
at the
so what
time,
Bush
you can't
does
really. Yeah, go ahead.
is he tries to take that feeling and transfer it onto his plan for Iraq.
Which we can surmise. I think it's pretty well known at this point that that plan had existed, probably even prior to him taking, taking the oath of office. It actually was
Yeah,
in the plan.
probably. I
Yeah,
wouldn't be able to say definitively, probably. Like that. That.
you know. Go ahead. Go ahead.
So what he starts doing throughout the course of 2002 is starts drum beating about weapons of mass destruction in Iraq, and they take it to the UN. And Bush has to solve a problem to invade Iraq. He gets NATO to agree to invoke Article 5 for Afghanistan, but
Mhm.
Iraq hasn't attacked anyone. The United States is about to launch a preemptive invasion. And it's not really a preemptive invasion in hindsight because Iraq has no plans or capability to launch a major attack against the United States. But he has to get everyone to think that that's what's happening.
Yeah, and at that time, the Iraqi economy, the Iraqi military, well, not so much their military, but their economy, I mean, their military insofar as the fact as their, ability to produce, missile components, chemical weapons, all of that had been pretty much degraded and, over the past decade. And as far as I know, um, the sanctions really, really devastated the economy. I mean, really, really made
Yeah,
the.
there was a pretty consistent running theme throughout the 80s and 90s and into 2000 for the United States military of confrontation to Iran, Iraq, both of those countries. Uh, Actually, that actually might be a fun thing to do on talk about the number of times that we decided to bomb things in Iran in the 80s.
Yeah,
At any rate, we get to this point where 2003 comes around and it's spring, and we have amassed uh, kind of too small of an army, right?
how much was the total force? Something like, I wasn't it. like 100,000 U.S. troops or something.
So when we took everyone into account, the strength, the order was about 400,000.
Hmm. Which is several times the amount of troops than Russia had.
Russia,
And
well, Russia.
yeah,
So Iraq is about half the size, give or take, of Ukraine.
it is. Yeah,
But
and
United
that was
States,
still too little troops.
the United States doesn't have enough troops really to take a whole country.
Hmm.
So they come up with a basic plan: is they're going to drive straight at Baghdad. And then the British go, they secure the area around Basra. The United
Yeah,
States Marines,
very close.
the city escapes me, but United States Marines launch a diversionary attack to draw forces away from Baghdad. And the entire thing kind of doesn't go as fast as they planned, but it's not as slow as they planned either.
And
So
that one city, let's look that up. That's where the ambush alley was, where you had some pretty heavy fighting, right? And there was
you're talking about Nasiriyah?
yeah, Battle of Al Nasiriyah, I think. Is that it?
That's one of that first big
Or
cities that the
later?
Marines hit, and Private
Yeah,
Jessica Lynch.
yeah, that's
Yeah,
when that logistics convoy with her
with
got
that logistics.
ambushed.
So that's a relatively infamous event. An American logistics convoy is lost. U.S. Army logistics convoy is lost. They get ambushed in the city of Nasiriyah. They're captured. Unspeakable things happen. I'm not saying the words because it's armed service. You can go look it up. And the city halts the American attack, and it's a puzzling thing for them because you know the Americans kind of read accounts from American officers and like we expect them to stand and fight in the desert at the Tigris and Euphrates like we would do if someone was attacking north from Florida into Washington D.C. hold at the
Hmm.
rivers. And they didn't do that because they didn't want to be exposed to American artillery and air power.
Hmm.
So a lot of Iraqi units in the south just sort of give up.
Yeah,
They run away, they disappear into the mist. Other units hole up in cities and turn cities into these readabouts where they can fight and mitigate that artillery and air power. So the Americans go into these cities now, and uh, sometimes they have problems being aggressive enough getting into those cities,
yeah.
and they get stalled out, and they get in the firefights. And
You know
so,
what's
like,
interesting? Yeah,
there's a
go
very
ahead.
high degree, not the number's not exactly known, but it's estimated to be as low as 100,000 civilian casualties in this initial phase alone. And that's because
That
we
I
were
did not know,
chucking
actually.
shells into these cities. You were fine. You just went body. Go lay down. That's because they're chucking shells into these cities, uh, trying to break these strong points so they can drive on through.
I remember, a lot of the tactics that you see, like at Al Nasiriyah and some of the fighting in Baghdad. Not as far as I remember, the fighting in Baghdad was not super intense in most areas. They were able to get to the with the thunder runs. They were able to get to the center of the city quite fast. But you see very similar tactics, except for the IEDs. You don't really see that yet, as far as I remember, and as far as I've read. But you see very similar tactics, ambush tactics that you would see in the insurgency. So already they're sort of, you know,
The core of
adapt
who is fighting, I think, at this stage is who
Republican
makes
Guard and Fedayeen, right?
Republican
Saddam.
Guard and Fedayeen, or who ends up making up the insurgency.
Yeah,
At least the initial stress is going to break on us all night. Okay. It makes sense that they would be this sort of trying out the things that they were going to work up to coming up. And things proceed apace, and I think Baghdad itself, yes, does come under American control relatively easily, but that's kind of just the start of the problem.
that's the very beginning of it. Definitely the very beginning of it. But you know, I really need to read up more on the insurgency and how it began, sort of the origins of it. I know, there's several different insurgent groups that exist. One being the Shia-led forces that is primarily aided by Iran. I think it's Al Sadr is the name of it's the Mahdi army, maybe. And then, of course, there's the Al Qaeda in Iraq, what would become ISIL eventually, and that is Al Zarqawi, I think, is the name of the. There's a Jordanian foreign fighter, and they actually existed in Iraq before the American invasion, but they were not. They weren't. They were on the border, I think, near Kurdistan, and they weren't at all allies of Saddam. In fact, actually, as far as I know, Saddam was trying to destroy them because they were a a potential.
If I recall correctly, they were within Baghdad in 3 weeks, bombed dead.
What'd you say?
If I recall correctly, they were by into Baghdad within 3 weeks from the kickoff date.
Oh, you mean from the 2003?
Yes.
Yeah, it wasn't very long. I think though, I mean, I look at this. I remember when it was happening, and I didn't
March.
really, have the critical thinking skills to really, think that this is going to become a big disaster.
4 weeks.
4 weeks. Well, so basically a month. But I never thought. I mean, I was so young. You don't really think of things like that. But I remember once, after Saddam even is captured, and then I'm wondering, why are we still losing troops there? And then, like, a few months later, you have about 800 people. The number doubles of U.S. soldiers that are getting killed there. And I didn't really have a concept of what an insurgency is, what an urban insurgency is, until I saw this war unfold.
Yeah, there is. Iraq is a complicated country. You basically have three sets of. You have three sets of people. You have the Sunnis, the Shias, and the Kurds. The Kurds are primarily in the north. The Sunnis occupy about the middle, and the Shia are in the south. Sunni and Shia are kind of, and I have to make sure I do this right, because I always mix them up.
I can help you with that, actually.
Sunni and Shia are two sectarian divides, I guess is the best way to put it.
Yeah,
Sectarian political divides, where the Shiites believe.
These are two branches of Islam.
Yeah, the Shiites believe that descendants of Muhammad must be religious leaders.
That's the Shia view.
And the Sunnis believe that they want to find religious leaders by consensus.
Yeah.
And this is a fairly deep division for them in this phase.
It's a deep division, but it's a very small, surprisingly small difference that has created deep divides, I would say.
It's not dissimilar. It's not dissimilar
between Catholicism, maybe,
between Catholicism and Protestantism.
Yeah.
And it has roughly the same effect.
Oh yeah.
It's very deep.
Like right in the start of the Reformation, kind of in 30 Years' War, Germany, all of that.
The French Wars of Religion, 80 Years' War, a good chunk of the 1300s onwards for Europe. And then the Kurds are kind of Kurds are a separate people, but they also occupy. Harry Sunday and his audience.
Wow.
We just got raided. These Kurds occupy a number of positions. They occupy northern Iraq. They're in Syria. They're in Turkey. They're kind of a vast ethnic group that sort of.
They're a vast stateless ethnic group.
Yeah, they don't really have a home.
Ironically, they're the largest Kurdish population currently is in the territory of Anatolia, and this is under the rule of
Turkey.
Turkey. This is under the rule of perhaps their worst oppressor, in history. I mean, Saddam got pretty close to being that, though. With
Welcome, everyone. Yeah, Turkey has been pretty aggressive
yeah,
about the Kurdish population in Turkey itself and in Syria, particularly after Trump kind of sort of screwed them hard. Chat is full of squids. Uh, at any rate, so you get to Baghdad, and a number of mistakes happen almost immediately. Uh, I think the most crucial one there is a fairly famous HBO series called Generation Kill.
this is a good,
Uh,
very good miniseries.
there's a book, Generation Kill, that generated that. Uh, but the book I read was by the officer who was depicted in Generation Kill, Nate Fick. He wrote a book called One Bullet Away.
Yeah, that's a famous one.
And I read that long before I ever read Generation Kill. And he talks about our the initial wave and what he envisioned for his unit as they moved into Baghdad. This kind of local force in a particular neighborhood, addressing this population's needs and doing things. And that didn't happen. So there's no consistency in the American occupation. So there's no relationship that's built. And in fact, you're talking about Al Sadr, and they actually interacted with him in the initial days after Baghdad. Uh,
I think that the Shia discontent. See, the thing is that Saddam's government was largely secular. It was dominated by, of course, he himself is a Sunni
yes,
Muslim, and he installed a lot of people from his, clan. That's from the Tikrit area. That's where he's from. He
the Tikrit
also, though,
Triangle.
the,
Yeah,
the interesting thing about Saddam, there's no disputing the fact that Saddam was a tyrant, a very evil man. There's no disputing the fact that he probably, arguably, um, with the Kurds in the late 1980s, mid 1980s, committed genocide against them. Um, we're not talking about a good person. However, um, he was sort of a linchpin that kept this very unstable country together. And I've had the pleasure of knowing quite a few Iraqis. Many of them were that I met actually in undergrad. They were part of what was called the Iraqi Student Project. It was an American NGO. I think it might have been founded by actually a former Peace Corps volunteer. And through this program, many Iraqi citizens were able to go to university in the United States, and I was able to meet at my university, my undergrad university, several Iraqi opinion of Saddam because he actually protected ethnic minorities. Well, certain ethnic minorities,
as long
Christians
as you
were
weren't Kurd.
protected.
Kurd.
As long as you weren't Kurdish, yeah.
Yeah,
Um, he actually protected them. Um, and yeah, almost all of them. I remember several of them. So I had some of them were of Assyrian descent. One of them's fathers was a soldier in the Iran-Iraq War, and another, my friend Ennis, was his father actually was a colonel in the Republican Guard. So I mean, if you were an ethnic minority in Iraq or a religious minority like a Christian, you had the opportunity to advance quite high, pretty far in society.
yeah.
Um,
However, all those people ended up fired fairly shortly after
that's
Baghdad.
the problem.
That's
This
the
is
next problem.
yeah,
A whole bunch of people were just utterly cast out without jobs, without anything.
and these are the military elite we're talking about. We're
Yes,
not talking about the
and bureaucrats and the people who are running the society.
yeah. And also, one thing that the United States military did, which Russia didn't do, um, when they invaded Ukraine, is we actually hit the infrastructure of Iraq very hard, the power infrastructure. And several months after the initial invasion, there were still entire neighborhoods without electricity, without running water. And this very quickly
Yeah,
led to resentment.
the situation in Baghdad deteriorates very quickly. The situation
Yeah.
throughout the country begins to deteriorate very quickly.
You know, we see a lot of pictures, of like the looting and the tearing down of the Saddam statue. But what you don't see, I haven't read any social histories. I don't know if any have really good ones have been written in the
Not yet.
English language.
Not yet.
Where they go to Iraq and interview civilians, in Baghdad during that time. I mean, there's been some very good, like there was a very good Frontline documentary, Once Upon a Time in Iraq, that I watched that explains the situation very well. But the one thing that I don't think you get a feel for is civilian, especially here in the United States. You're not going to get that because we don't like to really talk about this war at all. It's kind of like Vietnam in a lot of ways. You don't like to talk about, like, there's a lot of horrible facts about Vietnam that we don't like to talk about, specifically the outrageous amount of civilian death and deliberate targeting of civilians in many, many cases. So, you know, I can't compare Iraq. I mean, there's a lot of civilian casualties. I don't think that there's a really clear number. I've heard, I've heard reasonable estimates maybe at around like 100,000 civilian deaths as results of the war, but in
The result of
Vietnam,
the invasion is probably accurate.
yeah.
The result of the war has got to be bigger. Yeah, the
Oh, it's
statue thing.
of the war, because you have the consequences. You can think of the war as, a stone dropping into water, and the ripples, go. They're still. It's the ripples are still being felt, being affecting the country now.
Particularly because the war hasn't actually stopped. Yes, the
No,
statue. The statue was staged. There was one account that was written about the statue that called it spontaneous, but the book it was written in is notoriously bad.
Yeah.
Basically, the individual in question who wrote the book, his co-author wrote that section. The individual in question embellished this weird tale about being some kind of super marine sniper that no marine snipers ever heard of. The book is called Shooter. You can go look it up.
I've seen that. I've seen that book on
the book opens up with this weird thing where he talks about a time in Somalia where there were no Marines. And
So this is after the Marine contingent left Somalia.
yes, he talks about
Okay.
this weird time in Somalia where he took a sniper rifle and shot 2 Somali T-50 tanks. You'll
There's
Hi,
no
Bubba.
such thing.
There's no such thing as a T-50 tank, and
There's no such thing as a T-50 tank. And
certainly
by that
in
if you look
Somalia's
at, like,
inventory.
if you look at very few of the Somali militias at that time had
Could
any
operate a
working
tank.
kits.
Yes. So,
Most of their, like, my father used to collect. There used to be these really cool. They're really thin, sort of almost magazine-like books. Concord was the name of the publishing company, and it was journalists who would go to war zones and they took pictures of, they embedded with the UN contingents in various places. There's a lot of volumes on Bosnia, Croatia, and a lot of that, but there was one from Somalia, and I remember looking at these pictures of, broken down Somali, tanks that had, belonged to the Somali army when Somalia was a full-fledged nation. And there was actually an SA2 SAM system that
yeah,
you just see it like it's completely dismantled for scrap. So they didn't have that then. That aside, though, about the crowd and about the, you see that on TV, but what you don't see is, because here in the United States, we don't know what it's like when your power goes out, when you don't have access to medicine, when the invading force that is supposed to help you doesn't have a clear plan, doesn't bring enough aid to actually help you, even if their intentions are good. That builds resentment really quick. And for a lot of them, it's not like Iraq was a Stalinist state where you have multi layers of terror everywhere. You do have a very, you do have beyond
There are
authoritarian.
localized patches of oppression. Is probably the best way to describe Saddam.
Yes, you see some very bad oppression,
You
though,
see some very public and
especially in
bad
countries like
things, particularly in the north. Uh,
but in the north and in the south with the Sunni,
yeah, with
with the
the Sunnis,
the Shia.
uh,
But
the Sunnis pressing the Shias, yeah. But you don't necessarily see the kind of Saddam Hussein was not a cartoon villain.
no,
He was very much presented to us at the time as a cartoon villain.
no, yeah, but he wasn't. And when that when you go through that sort of hardship, whereas before the Americans invaded, your life was fairly normal, your infrastructure worked. That really it does breed resentment, even in idealistic people, even in people that would have generally supported it. It turned a lot of people against the American government, and it feels very, I could only imagine it feeling very horrible to be have your whole life uprooted by this force that just decides to invade your country without any real justification.
Yeah. So
You
this
know,
we have this collapse. We don't have a large enough army to do the job that we said we're going to do. We have captured Baghdad and have overthrown the government and effectively shut down most civil service, and we even have control of a good half of the country because we did a very targeted invasion. So
yeah,
the situation just falls apart, and there's no real chance that America
and
has.
all of the ammo stocks. So what breeds a very strong insurgency, and we've seen it in other places. For example, in Chechnya before the two wars started. Well, before the first war started, Russia actually pulled out its military garrisons there, um, and left behind a lot of ammunition. And that's basically what happened here when the Iraqi army was dismantled. There was no accounting for the large amounts of ammunition, anti-tank missiles, man pads, all of the stuff that you need for an insurgency. And even though their artillery systems are basically, the big sort of, bigger heavy hitters are gone, they can take those artillery shells. Several of them are 155 rounds. The Iraqi army was not all Soviet supplied. It actually had a very sort of diverse.
It's the diverse collection
Yeah.
of equipment
So
at the
you
end of the
had,
day.
a lot of explosives, a lot of, just weapons floating around. And you had sort of uh, a prime situation for insurgency to develop.
Yeah, and so
And it's kind of something that, I look at it in hindsight and I think how stupid was it to do this without any coherent plan? And I think that the people behind the war, they don't really think of that. That's not a primary motivation. So it's not, you can almost compare it in a way to, other very terrible events in history where, you don't, the motivation is primarily to create a situation where, American, you know, basically like the oil industry also, it creates a situation for the arms industry to start producing munition. So it helps a lot of people at the top. And that's primarily why it was started. It was to enrich people, both within the military industrial complex and also within the energy
well,
industry.
it's interesting too because like a lot of this is coming out now. Like the discussion that's being had is the United States military has changed courses. So Gulf War happens, and you have an army that's equipped to fight a conventional war,
Yeah,
and then we build an army that's designed around fighting an insurgency for the last 20 years. And now we're looking at retooling the army back into a conventional army again.
yeah,
And the other thing that the other thing to kind of get at, and this is kind of a dual crossover between Iraq and Afghanistan, is the development of the American counterinsurgency doctrine starts to come about relatively early on. And it's codified so that it's the thing that everyone's talking about by 2009.
There's a book I want to read. I just bought. I got it. I forget the author's name. I got the book. I'll get his name, but not the one I want to read. The author's name is Omar Ashur, and the book is How ISIS Fights. This isn't the book though that I want to read. He wrote a book called Bullets Not Ballots, and it essentially is a case study of 3 counterinsurgencies. And what his findings are is actually in counterinsurgency, in most cases, and he even looks at the Malayan example, hearts and minds policy doesn't work.
Well, you're not able to provide the people what they actually want. They want you to screw off and go home.
Yeah.
Because if you're not there, there's no reason for fighting.
Yeah. But essentially, that's the findings of his work, is that it's bullets, not ballots. So it's essentially force that destroys insurgencies, and you have to be willing to use it.
Yeah.
There's a book that I have too. It's by Alexander Statiev. It's called The Soviet Counterinsurgency. It's about the taming of the Western borderlands, so like Western Ukraine, the Baltics insurgencies after World War II. And remarkably, as heavy-handed and brutal they were extremely effective at destroying the insurgencies there.
Yeah, the Soviet
you
Union
have to be willing to get your hands dirty if you're going to fight that kind of war, because by its very nature, it is a dirty war. You cannot fight insurgencies through hearts and minds. It's almost impossible.
Yeah,
and that's kind of the I'm not saying that we should have done that in Iraq. That's exactly that. No force should, develop that sort of barbarism. But, from the get-go, counterinsurgency strategy in Iraq is flawed, because it's not gonna work. And also, like you said, it's the will of the people. What they actually want is for you to get the fuck out. It's for you to leave.
Yeah, if I remember correctly, the first election that was held in Iraq, it was a Shiite-led government.
Shiite-led government,
and it
also
levied pretty severe.
The installed president was actually an ethnic Kurd.
Yeah,
and there are a lot of people that hate him.
It led to a pretty severe backlash against the Sunnis.
Mm-hmm. There's a backlash against the Sunnis that's still going on, by the way. Actually, that gave rise to ISIL. But at the time, the backlash was very strong. You have it where
it was a question of vengeance for them at that point.
Yeah.
For being kept
and
down
that was
for
a
years.
little bit ahead of where we're going to go. But anyway, so the insurgency develops. Attacks. We can talk maybe a little bit about it, tactics of the insurgency. It seemed that overwhelmingly what they targeted was American logistics, particularly.
Yes, but the problem is at that point, nearly everything is logistics.
Yeah.
Yeah, here we go. 2003, Bush lands on a carrier in late 2003, puts up a sign that says mission accomplished. And as it turns out, the mission was not accomplished.
No.
That if you're old enough to remember the Bush years, were a lot of faux pas. I actually miss George Bush now. Mitt Romney made me miss George Bush, and Trump made me miss Mitt Romney.
I don't miss him at all. It's odd. I have I don't miss him at all. And actually I believe if I were to compare the two, I would consider the Bush administration, not necessarily him himself. I believe that he was not pulling all the strings and making all the critical decisions. I think he's more of a figurehead. But out of the two administrations, and I might get some flack for this, but I would argue that in terms of real human suffering and death, um, the Bush administration is one of the most evil that in American history, no doubt about that.
That
And that
might be fair, but
this war itself, and I'm not talking about, we can get into the argument about social policies and, various consequences of the Trump presidency. Of course, they're really bad. There's a lot of bad precedents, but, um, in terms of raw numbers of victims and lives upended, I mean, everybody that I knew, every Iraqi that I knew, even though they were part of that student project. So it's interesting, at the same time, they are benefiting from the invasion because they're able to study in the United States. But almost all of them, their parents don't live in Iraq anymore. And they had decent middle class lives, good lives in Iraq. They moved to Syria, one friend of mine, and then
that worked
that
out
family
well.
had to leave to Lebanon after that shit started. And then to Canada. Eventually, they were able to receive refugee status in Canada, and that's where my friend lives now with his family. Um, these are ancient communities that have existed in Iraq really uninterrupted for well over a millennia now. So, to create something for profit that just destroys people's lives like that, it's very evil. It is not as blatant and aggressive as Russia's war in Ukraine,
In some
but
ways, it
the end
is so.
result, but
But
yeah, the end result is the same.
there are parallels to be drawn, I think. Particularly today after Prigozhin came out with his pro-coup speech, which
Yeah, I was. We're gonna have to do an episode. Just a,
we're gonna be regrouping a lot in the next couple days as things turn into something that's talkable. I'm negotiating with Wick right now to do his panel on Monday on this, uh, and then we're gonna probably do our own thing without monkeys. But the what are you doing, dog? The end result of this insurgency kind of boils over, and the 2003 turns into 2004, and you kind of hit one of the first big milestones.
you
And
have those areas that we were talking about before that are sparsely manned by United States troops because we didn't have, an adequate amount of force to occupy the country. You have the Sunni Triangle. So I think the Sunni Triangle consists of Iraq, Ramadi, and maybe Tikrit. Maybe I don't
yes,
know. It's in
but
the western part of the country. These towns, these big actually they're big cities, fall into control of Sunni-led insurgents, and there's of course clashes, attacks on U.S. troops that are there each day. Um, and eventually, you have that incident out near the bridge where a Blackwater convoy is ambushed. One thing that we're missing in this whole presentation, and forgive me for not creating very detailed notes or coming up with something for this, but there are several attacks on civilians during this early insurgency phase that happen. There's one where there's like a group of mourners that are attacked by an Apache helicopter, kills a lot of people.
What that
And
sticks out of my mind is some kids playing in a tank that got.
yeah, there's that. And these incidents start to add up, and this builds a resentment in people.
Yeah. So that Blackwater incident that we're talking about happens. Bubba, sit down. Happens in a town called, or city rather, called Fallujah.
Yeah,
And this kicks off a massive attempt by coalition forces, more accurately, the United States at this point,
Marines at that point, and
the
it's in
Marines,
April.
to try to pacify the city. So there's uh, a great deal of fighting, and it's not really successful.
Yeah, the first attempt at retaking the city, as far as I know, was actually quite. A lot of people, we talk about the November battle, that November December battle that takes place, which is the
Yes.
more intense one, overall, and it's the one where we eventually take the
It's
city. It was
longer too.
hard fight. But the April battle, I remember watching it even, on the news. I remember me and my father were in Key West for a fishing trip, and I'm watching the fighting that is taking place, and I'm just astounded at, the intensity of it. And I think in that first battle, which was maybe like 2 weeks, the number of casualties on American forces were quite considerable. I think it was something like 49 people KIA, 49 Marines KIA, which is, for United States standards, I think that's
Yeah,
fairly,
there are a number
fairly,
of kind of equations that get factored into military science and military history that you like. I'm able to guesstimate casualties for Russia and Ukraine by using these equations. That's where I get the numbers for all your Russian Ukraine shows usually. Um, but those do not necessarily apply to the United States because we have heavily invested in things like Kazavat, casualty
yeah,
evacuation, and whatnot. Uh, so incidents like this are fairly significant. Combat like this and resulting in that many casualties is fairly significant. And
it is. Yeah,
the second battle kicks off in November, and it lasts 45, I think, 40, 45, 43
yeah, it's
days.
about enough. And now, it's back, it's relevant again because of the game, the new game
7
that is
days
coming
in
out,
Fallujah.
7 days in Fallujah. Yeah,
I don't actually think
which,
the game is ever coming out, but that's beside the point.
yeah, have you seen? It's already
I've
almost.
seen footage. It's out.
Yeah, I believe it's out now, and people are there's. I mean, there's a lot of praise for it actually, in terms of its realism, and a lot of the scenarios, the levels that you play, they're taken from actual
6 days in
events.
Fallujah. That's why I didn't see
Six
it.
days in Fallujah, and
Oh, it got released yesterday.
yeah,
Yesterday. That's
great.
why I didn't think.
Really, really, that's
It
our
went into
great
early
timing.
access yesterday.
We plan this, perfectly
No, we didn't.
because of release. We're just very lucky. But yeah, no, that battle was very significant because it's the heaviest fighting that the U.S. military has
Oh, it looks like we're
seen.
gonna make your laptop cry in a few weeks.
Really?
I just looked at the requirements. We're gonna make your laptop cry.
Oh yeah, it's yeah. I'm
It's
sure
not
that
that bad. It's pretty reasonable. It's 2 generations back for graphics card minimum.
yeah.
Uh, but still, I think you need to sit down.
So we clear Fallujah. The battle is the largest, the most bloody battle even now that the U.S. has fought since the Vietnam War, and it's the bloodiest urban battle since the Battle of Hue in Vietnam in 1968.
Yes. So,
There's a lot of comparisons, by the way, between the Battle of Hue and Fallujah.
Hoi City. There is a military operations in urban terrain mount is very difficult.
Not if you recruit a lot of convicts.
No, it's still pretty difficult, even if you recruit a lot of convicts. Uh,
What is Prigozhin going to do without all his convicts now? Actually, right now, it's one reason for this is that the contract of recruiting convicts is now passed to the Russian Ministry of Defense, and this is one of the causes for this conflict that is now developing.
I just
Also to divert a little bit, because this is very fresh right now, and I just got to state it. As hopeful as I want to be, I'm not going to make any predictions. I'm just watching this unfold.
think
And
it's kind of darkly ironic and kind of darkly hilarious that in Russia's invasion of
it is,
Ukraine,
but I'm not.
Russia has
I
invaded
don't,
itself twice.
yeah, I don't think people who are there's a lot of fervor right now of a Russia full a full coup d'etat, full scale civil war, and I'm not. I hate to say optimistic because I have family in Moscow, so I don't really want anything bad to happen to them. I still have good relations with them, but yeah, I don't have any. I'm not. I'm just gonna watch this unfold and not make any predictions. But
Speaking of which,
all I have to say
Wagner
is just
has announced they have taken the city of Rostov-on-Don, which I think is really the only direct thing between them and Moscow.
Rostov-on-Don.
Yeah.
Rostov-on-Don is south, so it's like where Donetsk city is. It's almost like that same
Yeah, it's like
latitude.
same
Moscow,
latitude, and then you go
Moscow
up.
is quite a bit north.
So you got to take Kursk. Never mind.
Yeah, actually Kursk is a little bit north of
Kursk is a little bit
Rostov.
north and the other end of Ukraine.
Yeah,
Geography with hands.
actually, a lot of these Russian, southwestern Russia is you have a lot of like Belgorod, as Ukrainians would call it, Belgorod in Russian, Belgorod. In Ukrainian, these were former Ukrainian cities of the UNR, and I mean that is kind of true, but it's these are borderlands. It's always very porous. But yeah, Rostov-on-Don is it's actually a heavily, in terms of the ethnicities there, a lot of the people that live there were of former Ukrainian descent. Most people have Ukrainian surnames, and it's a very Kozak heavy city. Like it has that sort of identity.
Yeah, here's the
Uh,
problem that the Ministry of Defense has. Their best troops are either in Moscow or in Ukraine.
yeah,
Uh, and the best troops that are in Moscow are kind of like on
which
paper
which
the best
actually
troops. Not
which
necessarily that they've seen any combat recently.
the positive note and what the hopeful view of this is that they will inevitably have to pull forces from critical areas on the Ukrainian front in order to contain the situation at home. And that's the hopeful thought that I have.
It's early yet.
Not
It's
too sure. I'm not
really
too sure.
early.
It's too early to tell. It's too early to tell. I'm not too sure how it's going to come into fruition. Okay, how did we get this far into Ukraine? Anyway, back
That
to
happens in
Iraq.
the show too much. Anyway,
Yeah. Uh,
Civil War.
so what?
Iraq Civil War.
Yeah. I want to get to the fact that after Fallujah, you have then Ramadi becoming the sort of next hotbed, and then you have a pretty bloody battle there, not the same as Fallujah, but a fairly bloody campaign there. And then in 2006, the civil war, the sectarian conflict just boils over.
This you see this increase by Al Qaeda in Iraq. Not the same Al Qaeda that did 9/11.
Yeah,
It's
not
pretty
the same at
vital.
all.
It's pretty vital to note that not the same one. They
Yeah.
just have the same name. It's kind of like a franchised McDonald's.
No, Al Qaeda is very much a franchise. In fact,
Actually,
I think
most terrorist groups are now.
I think that there's a book called like McTerrorist. It's something like that explains that about how Al-Qaeda is like a McDonald's franchise. There's many different, branches of it that pop up that have vastly different motivations and political goals. So, but anyway, yeah, they rank up. What Al Qaeda in Iraq does is they start attacking Shia holy sites. And some of these attacks, I remember reading about it in 2006. I was like 2006, 16 years old. Yeah, 17. And I remember reading, like a bombing in Iraq knocks 400 people. They were bombing festivals and things like this. And then of course, you have Shia retaliatory attacks. And all the while that this is happening, and this is the period that the friends of mine that I had from Iraq, who I want to have one of them on this show. I think I'm going to ask Anas to come on this show.
Yes, there are branches in
They
Africa.
remember this as being the most traumatic part of that period for them. Another friend of mine would recall walking to school every day and seeing in his neighborhood like bodies of people who had just been executed, shot by they lived in a Sunni area as Christians, and they saw the bodies of Shia that were in that area that were basically sort of cleansed out of it. People that were,
There were executions happening pretty routinely.
Yeah. But he said that's what he remembers very vividly. And all the while, American troops, I mean, during this period, they're fighting. I'm not like, but they're mostly in their bases. They're mostly not getting involved in intervening in this conflict.
Yeah, this is a very common thing. Like this starts almost immediately after the invasion ends. Is American troops get confined to bases except in specific circumstances. They do patrols, but they don't really. And if they happen across something, they interdict it. They don't really get involved in it. So like the insurgents can kind of just dodge if they want to. They can pick the fights with the Americans that they want.
And all the while, you have this war going on between
two groups of people who don't particularly like each other much, and now have no real force. Where Saddam and the Ba'ath Party provided an actual stopgap that stopped this from happening. But this also has a huge ramification.
A friend of my significant other is an Iraqi woman, and I was talking to her recently, and she told me she's a product of a mixed marriage between Sunni and Shia family, and her opinion of Saddam and her life during that period was quite positive. So that's one common pattern I tend to see with a lot of Iraqis that I've met. I mean, that's not certainly everybody, but a lot of these urban sort of middle class people, that is their general opinion of the pre 2003 Iraq, that it was probably the better times in their lives. But getting back to the Civil War, what leads to this surge? That is actually something that I don't have that answer to. I remember the facts were that the situation was deteriorating further with the sectarian conflict, and also I think IEDs and ambushes on U.S. troops are a daily thing, and that is to regain control of the country, right? Sort of the surge.
Yes. So
it worked, but at a very big cost. It was actually very bloody.
The surge happens a year after.
Yeah.
Good response time, by the way, Bush. The United States increases their troop count dramatically, and they change the general. So this is General David Petraeus, who you may remember from such sex scandals as he gave government secrets away to his mistress. That's actually the big one you might remember him from.
Yeah. wonderful talking head on the
Yeah, he now
Ukrainian
does. He
conflict.
now does. I think he does a stint on Fox and CNN. Uh,
People like him and Ben Hodges, I really, I don't have a whole lot of like. Sometimes when I hear them talk, I'm like, how did you become a general? You don't seem to really understand a whole lot.
it's an interesting discussion sometimes.
Yeah.
Petraeus is an interesting character. At any rate, what we have is about an increase of about 20,000, I think 21,000 troops, and then a planned drawdown. And this gives the military some punch, and they're able to do more aggressive patrols.
Particularly in the green or the Sadr city, the Shia,
Yes,
the heart of the Shia insurgency. That's when you see a lot of battles
and
there, and you basically see that Shia army knocked out of commission, as far as I remember.
the other thing that kind of happens is you start to see an improvement. Al Qaeda in Iraq is kind of uh, nullified to a certain extent.
Yeah,
And in their place rises ISIS.
and that's one of the things about Iraq, Al Qaeda in Iraq being nullified is that it's not something like
They were the much more reasonable terrorists.
no, it's not something like that their membership was completely decimated. It's more that it becomes more difficult for them to operate against the US forces at that time.
Yes, and ISIS
So they
takes
go underground
center
and
stage.
they kind of bide their time for the right opportunity. Also there's this process, during this whole period, we're building a new Iraqi army. And eventually in 2008, they're leading a lot of combat operations themselves. And then, or more or less afterward, the situation normalizes until about
Actually,
2013. Of 20,
2011, you see a significant drawdown of American forces in Iraq. To a
you
much
do,
of an advisory role, the Iraqi police and the Iraqi military have taken things uh, under their wing. However, 2010, you see the Arab Spring uprisings happen throughout the Middle East. And in this case, most significantly, in Syria, which borders Iraq, ISIS starts to come under control a significant portion of the border. You need to stop. Sorry, the dog is being a pain tonight. ISIS starts to bring the area under control in this border region between Syria and Iraq. Because Assad loses effective control of Syria almost immediately, and it has only really been restored. Only really been restored recently, with a considerable loss of life. At any rate, ISIS sort of flows over, and they do two things. They start moving into in 2015, and this is getting a little bit beyond our scope, but this is kind of where we're going to pick up next time because we are reaching your limit for the evening.
I think we're reaching Avery's limit.
We've definitely reached Avery's limit. He's about to go nuts.
Yeah.
What ends up happening is ISIS overruns significant portions of the Iraqi police and military, gets himself a whole bunch of equipment, and builds a conventional army.
Mm-hmm.
And Obama's like, no, don't get it twisted. We're going to bomb you. It does. And ISIS decides to switch back to insurgency tactics.
We're going to have to cover that fully because it's not that simple.
No, it's not, but I'm doing
not
kind
that
of
simple at all. But in any case, and I remember actually a post you made on social media during that happened. You're like, well, the Iraqi army broke and ran. what a waste. I remember when that happened, you actually, one of your witty comments about it, and they broke. And the interesting thing that this book, it's fairly well researched. One very effective thing about the Daesh, the IS military, is actually so they were able to take Mosul and some of these cities like
Mosul in particular, I think they had
Fallujah,
15 to
Fallujah. They were able
1.
to take them where, yeah, the Iraqi army outnumbered them
15 to
so
1.
15 or 50.
15 to 1.
Yeah, they were able to take them, these giant cities. And what the author argues is actually they had, unlike the Russian military, there was plenty of freedom of these little mobile groups in ISIS to make decisions on the fly.
Yes.
And this is what enabled their very rapid advance and their very, successful advance. But also the fact that I think the Iraqi army by that time was a corrupt mess. It was mainly filled with people who were, Shia in a place that wasn't heavily Shia. And you also had, some portions of the population that are supporting,
Yeah.
these
Just
cities. Yeah.
what's going to talk about that in the next one. But
Yeah.
that's just a final thought. You won't find an American officer who is doctrinally going to lead an attack unless they outnumber the enemy 3 to 1.
Yeah.
And that's on the assumption that you're going to lose 2 guys for every one of theirs.
Yeah.
But with that, we're going to go into the rest of that next time. I want
Sure.
to thank everybody for coming out. I want to thank President Sunday
Before
for
our next
sending everybody
Iraq
over.
episode, we might be giving an update on the situation, the developing situation.
We might be doing a Russia versus Russia update. So I want to thank everybody for coming out tonight. Next Sunday again for sending everybody over.
Yeah, thank you, President Sunday.
And we are going to be out.